Welcome to the City of Westminster Archives Centre. This evening, I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Antony Clayton, who will be telling us about the folklore of underground London. Antony's written a number of well-known books on the history of London, which often delve into the more hidden stories, and we hold several of these titles in our collection, including Subterranean City, London's Coffee Houses, Decadent London, and many more. I know he also has made good use of our archives collection for his research, and also the wonderful folklore collection at Kensington Central Library, and he's fast becoming a very popular speaker at our Borough Library events. So thank you very much, Antony, for joining us this evening, and thank you also to all of you out there who've joined us from home. The talk will last between 40 to 50 minutes, and there will be a Q&A afterwards. And that's it from me. We'll hand you over to Antony.
Thank you. I'm assuming I can be heard here. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this talk about the underground folklore of London. My name is Antony Clayton, as you heard. I was born in London, but I now live in Hastings on the south coast of England. And I should say that to do with folklore, there are plenty of legends down here of secret tunnels and smugglers, caves and that kind of thing. Over the last 20 years, I've written a number of books, as Susie has said in the introduction, some of which deal with aspects of the underground world of London and England, with more emphasis in recent years on folklore, myth and legend, rather than nuts and bolts facts. But if you want nuts and bolts facts, then the book I wrote, which came out in 2 editions, one in 2000 and this one here in 2010, Subterranean City Beneath the Streets of London, that covers virtually everything you'll find of a factual nature beneath the streets of London. Unfortunately, that book is now out of print for the last year or so. You can get it on places like Amazon and ABE Books, but that book's out of print. And as I hope there's quite a large audience out there this evening, I was just going to quickly suggest that if any publishers are watching or tuning in tonight and they would like to bring out a 3rd edition of Subterranean City in 2021, I have been planning to do that myself, but I think a big publisher with distribution and good design could make a very good 3rd edition. So if anyone's interested, maybe they might want to get in touch through Facebook or something like that, because that book was certainly, out of all the books I've written, that's the biggest seller by a long way. So tonight I'm presenting a selection of some of my favourite aspects of underground folklore centred on the capital city, and undoubtedly it's one of the most tunnelled under conurbations that you can find in the world. And by folklore, I mean the traditional beliefs, customs and stories of a community passed down through the generations by word of mouth, or more commonly these days via the media, social media and the internet, of course. We live in an age of so-called fake news and conspiracy theories, but the folklore I'll be presenting is pretty harmless, I think, and I hope will be entertaining for the next 40 or 50 minutes. Of course, you can make your own minds up as to whether there's any truth in these tales. Someone who I've recently read who seems to believe in some of these tales is the perhaps appropriately named Peter Gammons, who's the UKIP candidate for London Mayor, and I found a quote from him that said, "I want to get London moving again. There are over 2 million miles of unused tunnels, streets and chambers beneath London. This abandoned network was secretly built by the Ministry of Defence, Post Office and BT. I want to convert these disused spaces into walkways, safe cycle lanes, and create the world's first underground pod transport system." That sounds very ambitious, but there is definitely a sort of semi-secret network of tunnels, bunkers and subterranean structures under London, which I write about in Subterranean City, and there are many other books that you can get these days covering that area. But I think most of them are still in use, and they certainly don't run for millions of miles, as he said. Anyway, let's start with some of my selections out of the huge amount of subterranean folklore. I can only cover a tiny little bit this evening, so this is what I've chosen to display this evening. And this is Henry Mayhew, as you can see in the slide. In the Daily Telegraph editorial for the 10th of October 1859 made the following observation: "This London is an amalgam of worlds within worlds, and the occurrences of every day convince us that there is not one of these worlds but has its special mysteries and generic crimes. It has been said that beasts of the chase still roam in the verdant fastnesses of Grosvenor Square, that there are undiscovered patches of primeval forest in Hyde Park, and that Hampstead sewers shelter a monstrous breed of black swine which have propagated and run wild among the slimy feculents, and whose ferocious snouts will one day uproot Highgate Archway, while they make Holloway intolerable with their grunting." The notion that strange creatures are roaming the sewers and tunnels under London is obviously not a new one. The Daily Telegraph's fear of a porcine invasion from below was probably based on the researches of the indefatigable journalist Mayhew, who we see here. His account, captured in the absorbing sociological study London Labour and the London Poor, which was first published in 1851, offers us a fascinating insight into the folklore of the men who continue to travel through these underground channels for the offscouring of the city. And the men he's talking about they were called toshers, that's Toshers, and they would go into the sewers appropriately dressed, with a long coat with very capacious pockets, with a lantern, as you can see in this illustration here, and they would be looking for anything that they thought would be of value that had washed down into the sewers. Obviously, it was a very unpleasant job and quite dangerous as well, and there was the hazard of rats. And in fact, here is a rat catcher in the sewers, but there were also, as I said, these toshers. And there is a picture of the Fleet sewer, probably from the Victorian period. This is a quote from Mayhew. "There is a strange tale in existence among the shore workers of a race of wild hogs inhabiting the sewers in the neighbourhood of Hampstead. The story runs that a sow in young, by some accident, got down the sewer through an opening, and wandering away from the spot, littered and reared her offspring in the drain, feeding on the offal and garbage washed into it continually. Here it is alleged the breed multiplied exceedingly, and have become almost as ferocious as they are numerous. This story, apocryphal as it seems, has nevertheless its believers, and it is ingeniously argued that the reason why none of the subterranean animals have been able to make their way to the light of day is that they could only do so by reaching the mouth of the sewer at the riverside, while in order to arrive at that point they must necessarily encounter the Fleet ditch, which runs towards the river with great rapidity, and as it is the obstinate nature of a pig to swim against the stream, the wild hogs of the sewers invariably work their way back to their original quarters, and are thus never to be seen. What seems strange in the matter is that the inhabitants of Hampstead never have been known to see any of these animals pass beneath the gratings, nor to have been disturbed by their gruntings. And in fact, the Fleet River, as you may know, is one of the so-called lost rivers of London, and it rises on Hampstead Heath and runs down to what is now Blackfriars Bridge, and comes out as a sewer underneath Blackfriars Bridge. A much earlier sighting that seems more credible was reported in the Gentleman's Magazine in August 1736. It said, "A fatter boar was hardly ever seen than the one taken up this day, coming out of the Fleet ditch into the Thames. It proved to be a butcher's near Smithfield Bar, who had missed him 5 months, all of which time he had been in the common sewer, and improved in price from 10 shillings to 2 guineas. So the Victorian urban legend of the Hampstead sewer swine prefigures the famous rumour widespread from the 1960s onwards that the sewers of New York are infested with alligators descended from a few unwanted pets that were flushed down the toilets while still small. Now, the next thing I wanted to mention, there's a good slide of, it's right, I mean, rather exaggerated, but of the plethora of pipes and tunnels and utilities that run beneath the streets of most cities, including London. And down on the bottom right there, is what I think is one of the so-called utility subways or pipe subways that were built in the middle of the Victorian period to take the pipes of the gas and water and the burgeoning hydraulic power that was being used in London at that point, and then later electricity cables and telecommunication cables were run through these Victorian utility subways. So they were very handy because they were like tunnels under the streets that meant that you didn't have to keep digging up the road to install new utilities or make repairs, maintenance, what have you. So they were very useful. The first one was opened underneath Garrick Street in 1861, and you can still see them in central London and in the City of London. If you look carefully, there are various large grills situated in the middle of the street. I'll show you a picture of one in a minute. But there's one here that's quite interesting. If you go up Charing Cross Road, opposite the pub Molly Moggs that you can see on the left there, you may see on the right of that photograph there is a little traffic island with a grill, and if you go up to that grill, carefully crossing the road, and you look down, you'll see this, which is there's a couple of street signs saying Little Compton Street. So Little Compton Street you can find in maps from the 1790s. It connects old and new Compton streets in between Greek and Crown streets. And if you go onto the internet, you can find some information that says that at that time the street level was much lower, running at the height of the basements of today's buildings. Now that I don't actually agree with that, but the story is that in the 1880s, the Metropolitan Board of Works demolished the slum area that was around there so that they could create the Charing Cross Road to link Trafalgar Square and Oxford Street and Tottenham Court Road. As I said, obliterating a notorious slum district. And if you believe what you read on the internet, the street level was raised and an office block was eventually built on the site of Little Compton Street, consigning it to history. But Little Compton Street, according to this source, was turned into a Victorian utility subway that you can see in this picture here. But I think the reality is that they actually built, as part of the construction of Charing Cross Road, the Victorians built one of these subways under the street. And even though Little Compton Street was destroyed, perhaps the upper one of those two signs is the original Little Compton Street sign that they just decided to put into the utility tunnel. It's more likely that these signs here were just used by the maintenance engineers to see where they were, so they didn't have to keep coming up out of the ground to see which part of London they were in when they were doing their work in the utility subways. Okay, now that's one so-called lost street of London. That's another picture of the Little Compton Street sign. That's just been painted onto the wall, clearly. And that's one of the larger, grander utility subways that run, I think that's the one that runs up through Islington. So they can be very large. And that's one of the grills that you can, that one's outside Leicester Square tube station. And that's the same utility tunnel that runs up past Molly Moggs that we've just seen. That runs all the way down to Trafalgar Square. Oops, wrong way. Now, another street that is becoming very well known, I didn't know about at the time. When my book Subterranean City came out in 2000, I did some interviews in 2001, and one of them was on the Robert Elms radio show, and he asked me about a street of Victorian houses that have still existed underneath Oxford Street. Some Victorian shops, actually, with a cobbled street in front. And I didn't know anything about it at the time, but since then I've found quite a lot about it, and I've met people who say they've been down there, and it's a very interesting story. I've got my own blog called the Antonine Itineraries, and it's the most popular post by far on that blog. And I've recently done a kind of summary of some of the new evidence that I've put up on the blog. But just to briefly recap, I believe that this story of this street of Victorian houses that's under Oxford Street can be traced back to a film of 1991 that was made by Malcolm McLaren, who was, I'm sure everyone's heard of him, but he was the manager of the Sex Pistols. And earlier in life, he'd been a member of the Situationist group and fancied himself as a prankster. And I think this story is one of Malcolm McLaren's pranks. But anyway, that Ghosts of Oxford Street came out in 1991. It was a Christmas special on Channel 4. And for years it wasn't available, so I couldn't really check to see what people were talking about, because this street appears in this film, The Ghosts of Oxford Street. But nowadays it's up on the internet. I think it's on the Channel 4 website, so you can view it yourselves. And it's got music by the Happy Mondays, Tom Jones, Sinead O'Connor. It's quite an entertaining film. But at about half an hour in, there is a scene filmed in some sort of underground location where the actor John Altman plays Thomas De Quincey, the famous writer. And he does seem to be sitting in the remains of a very derelict shop, it has to be said, because the rumour is that these shops are perfectly preserved and there's a lovely cobbled street in front of them. But the shop that appears in the film, there's a handwritten notice that says Boots Apothecary, which looks totally bogus. And I don't know where this scene was filmed. Maybe if anyone does know, they could tell me. But I don't think it was filmed in a perfectly preserved street of shops under Oxford Street. So that is Malcolm McLaren there in a still from the film. And this is John Altman, who, as I said, played Thomas De Quincey, and this is the scene. And you can see, I'm sorry about the poor quality, but this is one of the very few images that I could find online. But that's him in this sort of dilapidated shop with surrounded by candles. Anyway, what happened was in April 2013, when I was about to do a talk, I contacted Selfridge's press office about this long-standing rumour, and they told me it was a myth started by the Ghosts of Oxford Street film, as I had originally suspected. But funnily enough, a few months before that, I was emailed by someone from the City of Westminster Archives, who are hosting tonight's talk, and they'd been contacted by a man who swore that he'd visited a street of shops somewhere underneath Oxford Street. Now, in the film, it's actually after the film, John Altman said that Malcolm McLaren had taken him into the basements of Selfridge's, and they got in through a hole in the wall into this street, this preserved street, and it's underneath Selfridge's. So that's why I contacted Selfridge's press office. And in fact, Selfridge's store does have a couple of very deep basements, one of which was going to be used by Eisenhower in the Second World War as a shelter. But in fact, he moved into the deep level shelter, which exists to this day as a storage facility under Goose Street Station on the Northern Line, just off Tottenham Court Road. So the story was that this street existed underneath Selfridge's, and I've mentioned it in a few talks over the years. And after I did a talk at Conway Hall, in the pub afterwards, someone came up to me and said that he had gone to Sainsbury's to deliver some clothes in the 1960s, and he had to take them down to a basement area that had been dressed to resemble a Victorian street. So it's very strange that you get these eyewitness accounts of things that don't exist. Anyway, this mystery is now deepened, because I thought it was all solved, but now there was a post on a online blog called The Great Wen that said it wasn't actually Selfridge's where this underground street was located, but it was Lilly and Skinner, the old Lilly and Skinner store, which is a little way east along Oxford Street, and that you could find the remnant of these shops under there. So a while after that, I happened to be going along Oxford Street, and I went into Forever 21, and they did have a basement, but I asked one of the members of staff, and they said there were no other basements below there, and they didn't know anything about any street of Victorian shops under there. But there are also on this post on the blog, The Great Wen. There are also some eyewitnesses accounts from people who claim that they'd been down to this street of shops when they were working there. So the mystery deepens, and the latest thing is that round the corner in Stratford Place, there's said to be access from there. So it's not actually from the shop. You may have noticed here from this slide that Forever 21 has been another casualty of the decline of the high street and has now closed down. So I haven't been up to Oxford Street recently to see what's going on. There's also rumours that there's a very large medieval cistern just close to there. But I mean, a medieval cistern is not a street of Victorian houses. And if you think about it logically, had this street really managed to survive intact, it's incredible that it's not been open to the public as an attraction or a vintage retail experience, especially given its hugely busy and tourist-heavy location. So Malcolm McLaren has not only given us the Sex Pistols, but also a piece of entertaining and enduring London lore. Okay, now, and I should also say that, the Survey of London study of Oxford Street came out in April this year, and I've had a look at it, and it goes into huge detail about the history and the land ownership of Selfridges and the Lillian Skinner site as well, but does not mention anything about a preserved street of shops anyway. Another huge development that took place in the end of the Victorian period, like Charing Cross Road, was the development around Kingsway. And as part of this huge, that was another notorious slum area that was demolished to make this, to make the Aldwych and Kingsway. And as part of that redevelopment, a pipe subway like the ones that we heard about earlier was constructed. You can see that's the course of the Kingsway and Aldwych here in this map. And that's a cross section of the pipe subway for the gas and water mains. It was 10 feet high and 17 feet wide on each side of the tunnel. The first public tram service from the Angel to the Aldwych commenced on the 24th of February 1906, and by April 1908 the tunnel had been extended to the Victoria Embankment, where it served as a link between the North and South Line tram systems. There were two subterranean stations at Holborn and Aldwych, and by January 1931 the tunnels had been enlarged to accommodate double-decker trams. The Kingsway tram tunnel closed on the 5th of April 1952 as trams were phased out in the capital, and the southern section was converted into a traffic underpass in 1964, and the northern section became for a period a GLC flood control centre and is now used for storage. Here are some old pictures of the trams going into the tunnel. That's when they became double-decker trams, and that's one of the subterranean stations, and that's in a more decayed form. And the link with Folklore here is that in April 2015 there was a very serious fire in one of those service tunnels that were on either side of the tram tunnel. It was an electrical fire in the subway, but it damaged an 8-inch gas main which ruptured and then fueled the fire. As you can see, there's a lot of smoke here, a lot of firefighters around. 5,000 people were evacuated from the area, including from the Royal Courts of Justice. And a spokesman for the fire brigade said it's been a technically difficult incident to tackle. The reason that the fire is still burning is because the service tunnel is hard to reach. Now, so you can see it's quite dramatic from that picture there, and a lot of people were evacuated. And later, a former head of the flying squad said that the fire may have been started deliberately by the people who robbed the safe deposit boxes at Hatton Garden, because that was the same weekend that this fire took place, and he thought it was used as some kind of diversionary tactic. But later reports said that it was purely an electrical fault, an accident, and it hadn't been deliberately set. But that's another little interesting piece of folklore that's grown up around that event. Now we move on to so-called lost trains, lost and buried trains. The picture you can see here is from the Illustrated London News. I think it's about the only picture that I've ever been able to find of this train. In Crystal Palace Park in 1864, test runs were undertaken for the Crystal Palace Pneumatic Railway, the brainchild of the engineer Thomas Webster Rammell. A single passenger coach that you can see here, accommodating up to 35 people, was blown and sucked back and forth by a large fan in a specially constructed tunnel 600 yards long, 9 feet wide and 10 feet high. The departure station, which again is what you see in this picture, was situated near the park's Sydenham entrance, and it ran towards Penge Gate. It's unknown whether there were any other stations. It just looked as though it was the one station, and the train went into the tunnel, was sort of pulled in and sucked out, and people had an interesting journey. After only 2 months, Rammell's experimental line ceased operating, and the last train probably ran on the 31st of October 1864. Then the tunnel was demolished, the station, engine house and all associated equipment removed, and the parkland restored to its former appearance. However, local legend claims that the tunnel wasn't demolished, but it was sealed up and forgotten, including the passenger coach that you see there was sealed up inside the tunnel. An excavation by the London Underground Railway Society in 1975 uncovered a flooded brick-lined tunnel, but it was much narrower than the one that housed the elusive railway. Now, remarkably, in 1978, a woman walking in the palace grounds claimed to have fallen down a shaft around 20 feet in depth, which deposited her in a dark tunnel. Lighting a match, she was horrified to find herself confronted by a carriage containing a number of skeletal passengers in full Victorian attire, slumped upon the seats and floor. The shaken witness managed to escape by climbing back up the shaft into daylight. And people swiftly investigated. Some of the local historians got involved, but they couldn't find any trace of this mysterious shaft, which was supposedly located near the site of the Crystal Palace and nowhere near the original course of Rammell's railway. A further excavation attempt in 1989 uncovered the base of the tunnel and some remains of the standard gauge track, but no carriage with or without its decaying occupants has ever been found. Now, a similar story is told of an event that is said to have occurred when the original Wembley Stadium was being built between 1922 and 23 in preparation for the British Empire exhibition of 1924 to 25. Either a spur from the nearby main line or a specially constructed narrow gauge railway was used to ferry materials in and out of the site of the new stadium. During construction, one of the steam locomotives met with an accident, it was said, becoming derailed or falling into an excavation. As the operation to recover the engine was considered too difficult, the decision was made to bury it where it lay, directly beneath what would become Wembley's hallowed turf. Wembley Stadium was rebuilt from 2003 there, and the new stadium opened in March 2007. As the new pitch was 13 feet lower than the previous one, it would appear that the lost locomotive was either buried very deep or didn't exist in the first place. And according to one account, or some accounts that you can find now, it was quite interesting because there used to be another structure on that site, which you have a picture of here, which was started in the late 1880s in emulation of the Eiffel Tower, which had recently been completed in Paris, Gustave Eiffel's magnificent piece of engineering. And Sir Edward Watkin, who was chairman of the Metropolitan Railway, which ran through Wembley, he decided that he would build a tower that would be even greater than the Eiffel Tower. And construction started in 1893, construction started. But they only ever got as far as the first level, and you can see a photo of that there. It never got any higher than that. And very few people came to visit. The money ran out to make it taller, so it became a real white elephant. And the marshy ground caused the foundations to shift as well, and eventually it was abandoned and demolished between 1904 and 1907. But that was on the site of Wembley Stadium. And if you look in some sources online, it claims that the bottom of those supports there were made of concrete, and inside the concrete they put parts of scrapped steam engines to strengthen the concrete. So maybe that's again part of this legend of the buried, in some form or other, the buried locomotive underneath Wembley Stadium. Okay. And if you go online, you can find quite a very good article from Heritage Rail in the year 2000 about that story. Now, another staple of folklore here is The Secret Tunnel. That's my book that I wrote called Secret Tunnels of England, Folklore and Fact. Copies will be available to buy later after the talk online. There aren't many left, I should say, but that book has done quite well. And secret tunnels, of course, never fail to excite the imagination. These subterranean passageways are a frequent means of access and escape in countless mystery novels and films. The history of many an ancient house includes the legend of a secret passage leading to a nearby church or inn. And while some secret hiding places and tunnels undoubtedly once existed, or still survive, the vast majority of these intriguing stories clearly belong in the realm of folklore, or are fanciful misinterpretations of drainage tunnels, underground conduits, or cellars. And many of them become associated with figures from English history like Oliver Cromwell, Elizabeth I, Charles II, Nell Gwyn, and perhaps most famously Dick Turpin, who seems to have spent his entire life constructing underground stables and underground tunnels from one pub to another all over the country. So that's quite incredible. But I'm just going to talk about a very small number of secret tunnels, actually, because obviously a place like London is apparently undermined by thousands of miles of secret tunnels, and I've covered quite a lot of those in the book, the Secret Tunnel book that you just saw. I just thought I'd choose one or two here. These are from pubs. This one here is called the Morpeth Arms, and it's at the corner of Ponsonby Place and Millbank, and it's on the other side of the river from the MI6 building, which we'll see in a second. Now, I don't know what the situation is these days, but certainly a few years ago and before the lockdown, you used to be able to have a tour around the cellars of the Morpeth Arms. And in the pub's extensive cellars, 5 grim, damp arch spaces are alleged to be the remains of cells used to hold prisoners from the Millbank Penitentiary before they were shipped overseas. This seems unlikely given the size of the nearby prison, as do rumours of a long bricked-up tunnel leading from beneath the pub to the river. Now, when you go on one of these tours, the supposed site of the tunnel entrance pointed out down below lies in a dark corner where some steps were later inserted, but this section lies in the direction of the prison rather than the Thames. The Millbank Penitentiary was closed in 1890, demolished in 1903, and now today it's the site of the Tate Gallery. So this is a photo I took down on one of these tours. It's a nice thing to do, and that's, I think, at the end of that corridor, that's where the secret tunnel allegedly runs down to the River Thames from the pub. I mentioned just now that there are many figures from English history who have become almost figures of folklore because of the number of strange legends and myths that have attached to them. And Nell Gwyn seems to be one of the principal characters. There are 2 pubs named after her in the West End. This one is opposite the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, the Knell of Old Drury, which is a name that was given to it in the 1960s, but there had been a pub on that site for about 300 years, I think. I took this photo on Halloween a few years ago, but you can see here, it says on this plaque that it said that Charles II used a secret passage beneath the road which connected the pub and the theatre when he wished to meet Nell Gwyn. And this is a constant part of the folklore of Charles II and Nell Gwyn, that they would always conduct their trysts in some kind of secret passage or subterranean structure of some kind, because of course she was the king's mistress. Right, and oh, in that pub there, the Knell of Old Drury, I did ask the landlord if I could go and investigate any remains of a secret passage, but I wasn't allowed to. But I was allowed to in this pub here, the Red Lion, in Crown Passage, which is just off the Pall Mall, and there was, because there was a building there where Nell Gwyn was installed in her own house, and it's quite interesting. If you go down into the cellar of this pub, the Red Lion, there are two doorways on the wall that are facing down towards the Mall. So whether these are the entrance to tunnels, who knows? But it is interesting that there are two bricked up doorways down there facing towards the Mall. So maybe some of these rumours have some kind of factual basis, who knows? And another story of a secret tunnel, more recent, is MI6 building near Vauxhall Cross, designed by Terry Farrell, is supposed to be linked by by a tunnel under the river that goes over to MI5, which is just on the other side of the river. Again, could possibly be, who knows? It's stranger things have happened. Now, another aspect of underground London, underground folklore, is ghosts. And I would definitely recommend a documentary that was on telly in 2005 that you can now find online on YouTube, I think. It's called Ghosts on the Underground, and it's narrated by Paul McGann. What I like about it is that it doesn't, like so many documentaries now, do these very poor reconstructions and recreations of events, whereas this is just eyewitness accounts of people who claim that they've seen various ghosts and supernatural occurrences on the underground, and most of them, I think virtually all of them, are underground employees, who've been working in the stations late at night. So that's very definitely well worth watching. Probably one of the most famous ghosts on the underground is that of the actor William Terrace, who was stabbed to death on stage at the Adelphi by a jealous rival, and his ghost was said to haunt not just the theatre but also the station, Covent Garden Station. He was murdered in 1897, although the strange thing is that Covent Garden Station didn't actually open until 1907. So it seems a bit strange that he would be haunting a station that opened 10 years after he died. Anyway, that's the famous story of William Terrace. And the last sighting of him was, I think, the last time I've heard about it was in the 1970s. Now, you're probably aware that on the Underground network there are quite a lot of stations that are no longer in use for various reasons, and they're known as ghost stations, which is quite nice. And some of them can be visited these days. London Transport Museum over the last few years has been running tours to some of these stations, like Down Street and some of the closed off areas of Charing Cross, for example. And they've also been running during the lockdown, and I hadn't had a chance to do any of those, some virtual tours of some of the other more difficult to access stations, such as Brompton Road, which you can't go to as part of a walk or a visit, but you can do it virtually. Now, another of these stations that you will never be able to go down and visit is called British Museum, and that opened on the 30th of July 1900 on the Central London Railway. Oh, there we are. There's a famous book about haunted London by Peter Underwood, which I remember reading when I was a teenager. And this is a map of the Central London Railway. And if you look over towards the right-hand side, between Chancery Lane and Tottenham Court Road, is the British Museum station that, as I said, opened in 1900. In 1907, a new station opened nearby on the Great Northern Piccadilly and Brompton Railway, which we now call the Piccadilly line. and that station was Holborn. And they were very closely situated, these two stations, but they were on different lines. So there was a proposal to link the two stations by a subway, but that was rejected, and passengers instead had to walk a couple of hundred yards between the two stations, which was a bit inconvenient. So in 1930, work began on expanding Holborn to create a combined Central and Piccadilly line station, which eventually opened in September 1933. So the old British Museum station closed at the same time, so everyone was just using Holborn Station. So in the British Museum station, the platforms were dismantled, and during the Second World War, it was one of those handy places that could be used as a air raid shelter. But by 1989, the street level building had been demolished, and the former lift and staircase shafts were filled with concrete for the foundations of a new office block. So let's have a look at some of these pictures. They're quite nice. That's the old entrance to the British Museum station. That's an old postcard of what it looked like down on the platform. You can see the platforms all made of wood in those days. That's the old station entrance building, but that was demolished, as I just said, and there's this new, well, not new, but there's this postmodern block there that you can still see today. But that was the entrance, that was the original entrance site to the station. But as I said, everything's been filled in now, so there's no way you can get from the ground down to the station. So the only way of access is along the rail tunnels. And these photos were taken by urban explorers who are not condoning in any way, but they go down to these underground stations. They go through the tunnels and they take photographs, and they investigate parts of the underground network that are off limits to the general public. So these photos were taken by some of these urban explorers. So this is what it looks like inside the British Museum station today. This is a nice old photo from the days when the station was open, and there's this nice advert that's part of the brick wall there. And then if you can then contrast that with this modern or more modern picture of one of the urban explorers, it's the same advert but taken from a different angle, but you can see it's still there, so that's interesting. Now, before the closure of the station in 1933, there were said to be reports that the station was haunted. And if you look online and read some of the literature about it, it seems that the station, the British Museum station, is haunted by either an ancient Egyptian ghost or the ghost of a mummy, whatever that is. According to the Daily Mail of Halloween 2015, they said, legend has it that the disused station is haunted by the ghost of Amun-Ra, an ancient Egyptian god dressed in traditional Egyptian loincloth and headdress. And a couple of years after the station's closure, 2 women vanished from nearby Holborn station, with witnesses claiming that they heard ghostly moaning around the time of their disappearance. Now, as far as I can see, I've done a bit of research into this. It does look as if this haunting of the station has become entangled in some way with the story of the so-called unlucky mummy at the British Museum. This is a picture of the so-called unlucky mummy. It's exhibit number 22542, and it's from the 21st dynasty, circa 950 BC. And it's a mummy board, a wooden cover that's placed over the body, carved and painted to represent the deceased as if they were alive, part of a Egyptian sarcophagus. Anyway, the story goes, it's too long to go into. I'll just show you here. This book, The Mummy's Curse, by Roger Luckhurst, is a scholarly examination of the various curses that are associated with mummies over the last couple of hundred years. And he goes into great detail about the story of this unlucky mummy. Very briefly, it was said to have been bought by some young men who visited Egypt in the 1860s. They all came to sticky ends, and it gradually went through various families. It's said that Madame Blavatsky saw this mummy case, mummy lid, and said that it was pure evil. and eventually it was given to the British Museum as an exhibit. And ever since then, anyone who photographs it, or lots of people who come into contact with it, have some kind of terrible disaster happen to them. And so it's accumulated this huge accretion of mythology and folklore around it. And perhaps the most incredible is the fact that it's said that it was traveling on the Titanic when it sank, and that was the whole reason for the sinking of the Titanic. In fact, it was still in its case in the British Museum at that point. It didn't go on any kind of exhibition outside the museum for many, many years after that. So it's an incredible story, but the best way to find out the truth is to look at that book, The Mummy's Curse by Roger Luckhurst. And in the 1930s, there were the various mummy films. That's Boris Karloff, I think, as the mummy in one of those films. And so this story has somehow become connected. The story of the unlucky mummy has somehow become connected with the British Museum station. Well, obviously, British Museum station was where you would have got off to go to the British Museum, where the unlucky mummy is. So I think that's one of the ways that it's been connected. And another way will come up shortly to do with popular culture. Now, I've been, just as a bit of fun, I looked through the various sources for this story of the mummy haunting, or whatever the creature is haunting the old British Museum station. And these are the various possibilities I've come up with, taken from written and internet sources. So one is an ancient Egyptian in traditional headdress and loincloth, or the Egyptian god Amun-Ra or Amen-Ra, or the mummy of the god Amun-Ra. I'm not quite sure how you mummify a god, but anyway, the priestess of the cult of Amun-Ra, said to be depicted on the mummy board in the British Museum, the mummy of the priestess of the cult of Amun-Ra, the priestess of Amun-Ra, the princess of Amun-Ra, the princess Amun-Ra, or an Egyptian looking for his mummy. So you can see that this whole thing has got out of hand. In fact, Roger Luckhurst says that online fragments of different sources have been combined and recombined in a delirium of desourced cut and paste text. And that's the sort of result that you get there. So I think the way that popular culture has influenced this story is through this film called Bulldog Jack, which came out in 1935, 2 years after the closure of the station. And Bulldog Jack is Jack Hulbert, who was a very popular actor and sort of comic actor of the period. And it's based on the Bulldog Drummond. He was a kind of 1930s James Bond, I suppose you could call him, who gets into all kinds of adventures with damsels in distress and foreign spies. And in this film, the actual Bulldog Jack is Bulldog Drummond is injured in a car crash, and so his friend Jack Hulbert has to take over one of his adventures, and this is the result. So there's a team of villains led by Ralph Richardson who break into the British Museum, and they want to substitute a valuable necklace for a fake. And the fake is manufactured by the father, the jeweler father of Fay Ray, who's famous from the King Kong films. And the leader of the group of villains is played by Ralph Richardson. A lot of the scenes are set in an abandoned underground station, which in the film is called Bloomsbury. And it's linked by a secret tunnel that comes out in the British Museum. In fact, it comes out in a sort of medieval tomb that raises, the lid of the tomb raises up, and the villains can come in and out of the museum at will down the secret tunnel back to Bloomsbury. Now, in one of the books about ghost stations on the underground, they make a mistake and say that it's an Egyptian sarcophagus that opens up, which makes it even more interesting, because I think they've been thinking about this story of the ghost of Amun, or the mummy of Amun-Ra haunting the station. So they make it. But if you actually look at the film, it's not an Egyptian sarcophagus. It's a sort of medieval tomb. I think that film's available on YouTube nowadays to watch. Yeah, so I think that's been a big influence on the whole story of the haunting and the secret tunnel that runs from British Museum Station to the British Museum. There's a still from the film. It looks very realistic, but I have found newspaper articles from the 1930s about the set, which I think was at Pinewood Studio. So it's all a set. It's none of it's been filmed in an abandoned underground station. Certainly not in British Museum Station. That is all just a film set. And as I said, if you look on the internet, for example, here's a quote. It's often said that on the night that this movie opened, this Bulldog Drummond, this Bulldog Jack, two women went missing from Holborn Station, and never described marks were found in the British Museum Station during the investigation. Well, I did a bit of it, looking around on the British Library newspaper archive, and also at the Camden Local History archives, and I've not been able to find any articles that have mentioned this disappearance of these women in the mid-30s from Holborn Station. But of course, what happens is that because British Museum Station is no longer accessible, the ghost over the years has now moved to Holborn Station. So if you look online, you'll find that this ghost of the mummy of Amun-Ra now haunts Holborn Station, because that is still accessible to the public. And Holborn is due for a big refurbishment soon, so I hope they don't disturb the spirit of Amun-Ra. Okay, now another film that uses folklore is called Deathline, and that came out recently in the last couple of years on Blu-ray. It's directed by Gary Sherman and came out in 1973. And I think the interesting thing there is that a lot of the action is set around Holborn Station, and it tells the story of a cannibal who has survived from a group of tunnellers who were working on the construction of the railway, the Underground Railway, and then there was a collapse and they all got trapped. And for some reason, they decided they were going to stay underground, and he was the only survivor of this whole group. And he'd survived right up into the 1970s by some miracle. And the reason he survived is he would go around to the various platforms and out, because he lived in the tunnels, somewhere hidden in the tunnels, and he would come out onto the platforms late at night and catch unwary travellers and kill them and take them back to his lair and devour them. And this is what the film was called in the United States, Raw Meat. So it gives you an idea of the cannibalistic subject matter. And here's a still from Deathline of another unfortunate victim who's going to end up as part of the dinner. And this is the cannibal, who is actually portrayed in a very sympathetic way by the actor, and you do actually feel quite sorry for him by the end of the film. Although in this picture, I think he looks quite like Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull. And now, any of you sharp-eyed viewers might notice this is a still from the film, and it says on the right that it's Russell Square. But if you look in the middle here, where it says Way Out and District Line, the District Line does not connect to Russell Square. So this was filmed in one of the stations that's always used for making films for the last few decades, because it's been abandoned for a long time, is the Aldwych station. So that's where a lot of these films are made. Modern films tend to be made at the Charing Cross Jubilee Line station that's been closed. I mean, for example, Skyfall was made there. The scene in the underground was made there. But a lot of the old films were made at Aldwych, as was Deathline. Another famous film, well, not that famous, but came out, can't remember when, about 2005, directed by Christopher Smith, called Creep. That features the German actress Franka Potente, who plays a woman stranded late at night on the London Underground. Again, it was filmed at Charing Cross. And if that weren't bad enough, she's also being stalked by a ruthless mutant killer and discovers a labyrinth of unknown tunnels and a sinister, disused underground hospital. The killer's lair is in the Down Street abandoned tube station. And on the Internet Movie Database, the entry for Creep someone who's probably male, I would imagine, has kindly listed all of the continuity errors resulting from the use of different tube train stock in the film. Right, now we're coming towards the end here. I just wanted to mention one of my favourite films, which is Quatermass and the Pit, which came out in, I think it was 1967, written by Nigel Neal, and he uses a lot of folklore motifs in the film. So if you haven't seen it, I think it's well worth watching. He manages to use ghosts and images of the devil and imps and demons in various forms, who all, in fact, owe their origin to the Martians, who had sort of interbred with humans way back about 5 million years ago. This is their spaceship that's unearthed. The whole film begins with the unearthing of this Martian spaceship, which they originally think is a bomb from the Blitz, and it turns out, of course, to be something much, much older and much more sinister. And that's a nice book that was written about the film by the film critic and writer Kim Newman. So there's a whole book now about Quatermass and the Pit. And I do wonder whether it influenced a ghost story, because in 1967 the film came out, and in 1968 a disturbing series of encounters occurred during the construction of the Victoria Line extension to Brixton. An unusual hazard was said to have been discovered in a short stretch of the southbound tunnel between Victoria and the Thames, just to the north of Vauxhall Bridge. Several members of a team of Irish navvies who were lining the newly dug section reported encounters with a large ghostly figure that became known as the Quare Fella. An article in the Sunday People featured stories from some of the tunnellers. Lou Chalmers, who was known as Big Lou, was quoted as saying, "I tell you, I served in the paratroops in the war, but I've never been so scared as when I came across this thing." I'm not going to do it in an Irish accent, you'll be pleased to hear. "There I was, working alone in the tunnel, when I felt something brush the back of my neck. I turned round. It seemed about 7 feet tall, the shape of a man with his arms outstretched out to get hold of something. I didn't stop to make out details, I just ran." And it was reported that another man who also saw the menacing spectre came up immediately from the workings, white and shaking, took a stiff drink and promptly quit. Speculation at the time that the ghost was the victim of the Great Plague, disturbed by the excavation of the pit in which he and hundreds of others had been flung 300 years before, was confounded by the fact that one of the workers had noticed that the Quare Fella wore a modern brown overcoat and cap. There were also reports of unusual banging sounds emanating from the pipes lining the tunnel. Press coverage at the time played up the superstitious Irish angle, but there does appear to have been something mysterious going on down in the depths of the Victoria Line. But I do wonder whether that was influenced in any way by the Quatermass and the Pit film. And another classic that's set in the London Underground is Doctor Who. I remember this series very clearly. It's called The Web of Fear, and it came out in 1968. And there are these robot Yeti that are unleashed on the tunnels of the London Underground at some point in the future. And it very much scared me when I was a little boy. And it was one of those series that disappeared. Everyone thought it had vanished. But in fact, recently they found, I think, most of the episodes apart from one, and it's come out on DVD with one of them done as a kind of teleplay thing, whatever they call them. What do they call them? Telesnaps. But I have seen it, and it's really good still. Okay, to finish, this is William Little. Let me find my notes here. For over 40 years, William Little, a retired electrical engineer, spent much of his spare time carving out an underground empire beneath his dilapidated house at 121 Mortimer Road in Hackney. Persistent complaints from neighbours resulted in the council obtaining a court order in 2006 to temporarily evict Mr. Little in order to undertake structural surveys. They discovered a labyrinth of chambers and tunnels around 8 metres deep, some of which stretched for 20 metres in all directions. The council said that work to fill in the extensive excavations will cost £100,000, which will be billed to Mr. Little. Known locally as the Mole Man, he told reporters, "I first tried to dig a wine cellar, and then the cellar doubled and so on. But the idea that I dug tunnels under other people's houses is rubbish. I just have a big basement. It's gone down deep enough to hit the water table. That's the lowest you can go. So the mole man of Hackney, I think he died in, when was it, 2010 or something like that. The house was sold for £1.2 million in 2012, and the architect David Adjaye has converted it for the artist Sue Webster, who's part of the partnership of Noble and Webster. And they had to dig out 2,000 tonnes of concrete that had been used by the council to fill in the tunnels. And when they were doing all the excavations, they found a boat, I think, and 2 or 3 cars. It's quite amazing. And this is what the house looked like. And then it was refurbished, as I said, by that famous architect. And this is what it looks like today after the refurbishment for the artist Sue Webster. And that's one of the underground parts of the house. So it looks very, very different to how it did when the mole man was living there. And one final piece of folklore, I think, is if you read the book by Ian Sinclair called Hackney, That Red Rose Empire, he says that he went round and with the mole man, he was taken down through one of his famous tunnels, and it went on for a long distance. And when he came out, he emerged at Dalston Junction railway station in one of the tunnels under there. I think that's a piece of Ian Sinclair's folklore, but I hope it's an appropriate way of finishing today's talk. Sorry it's run over by about 10 minutes, but I think there will still be a bit of time for a Q&A. Here's the books. I've written quite a few, but many of them are out of print. I want to bring them back into print myself at some point, or with the assistance of a publisher in the case of Subterranean City, perhaps. If you go on the internet to the Big Cartel, you will find copies of The Secret Tunnels of England and some of my other books, which you can purchase. I've lowered the prices just for this evening, and I have a blog called The Antony Itineraries. Okay, well, thanks very much for your patience. Thanks for tuning in. There might be time for a few questions. I'll just hand you back to Susie, who introduced me at the beginning of the talk. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Anthony. That was fantastic, and definitely gives us a lot to think about when we're travelling the London Underground. Yeah, we have gone slightly over, so for anyone that needs to leave us at 7:30, thank you very much for joining us, and we will be sending out a feedback email after this asking you for feedback on the events, and it will also include a link to where you can buy Anthony's books from Accumulator Press. So that will be going out to you about 8 o'clock. We do have a number of questions in the Q&A. Just to remind anyone that can stay after 7:30, if you want to put a question in the Q&A, you can just click on the little speech bubble with a question mark and just type your question in there. So we're going to go to the first question now, and this is from Paul Boulding, and he says, I believe there was a compressed air utility that ran under Oxford Street and other parts of central London that served the tube systems, carrying cash and paperwork in department stores and even church organs. Do you know anything about this?
Yes. I think it was called this is all a long time ago now. I think it was called the London Pneumatic Company or something of that kind. I wrote a lot about it in the Subterranean City book. But yeah, there was a network of pneumatic pipes that were powered by air pressure that were and in fact there was a whole underground post office railway that was powered in that way by the London Pneumatic Company. So the tunnels were about 4 feet high, something like that. But there was also a network of like the ones you used to see in for those who are old enough to go into the old department stores, where they used to have these networks of pipes where they used to send documents and invoices and bills and things around the department store by pneumatic pressure. That was a kind of larger version of that was under the streets of London, and they do still find some of these pipes now and then when they're doing roadworks or major redevelopments. So yeah, that's not folklore, that is absolute fact.
Okay, that's good to separate the two. We've got another question here from Dee Dee. With all these tunnels and spaces under the City of London and the increase in traffic, is there any danger of sinkholes? Or an idea, have there been any instances?
Oh, well, yeah, there was actually oh, I think my pizza delivery's just arrived. Anyway, let me carry on. Yeah, now there was a famous incident in South London near Blackheath. I can't remember the exact location, but again, it's in the Subterranean City book. But it was an area where there'd been a lot of chalk mines going back to the 17th century, I think. And those chalk mines had definitely undermined the area there. And there was a major problem with a huge hole that opened up in the road, which was quite a busy road through that part of southeast London, near Blackheath, near Jack Cade's Cavern. It's the area known as Jack Cade's Cavern, and yeah, that was a major problem, and it took a long time to fill in the massive hole that had accumulated from the years of tunneling, the chalk tunneling. So it does happen, yeah. Not like it does in some of the spectacular ones that you see on the telly, but yeah, London has been so comprehensively undermined that there are the occasional problems like that. I think there was another one that occurred as part of the construction of the Channel Tunnel rail link. Someone's garden collapsed, I think, but so you do get these things happening, yes.
Okay, that's interesting. Right, we've got one here from Catherine. Could ground-penetrating radar assist in discovering if a mythical preserved underground street might actually exist?
Yes, yeah. I mean, nowadays you've got ground-penetrating radar and various other technological wonders. So yeah, if you look at if you look online, there's a very good map that they've made of Nottingham. Nottingham is one of the most dug under places in the UK, I should say, outside London, and again it was mainly for mining, and they have now mapped, I think, all of the tunnels under Nottingham, and it looks amazing. If you look at the sort of 3D imagery of it, they have managed to sort of map it all. So yeah, I'm afraid that does mark the sort of death knell. This modern technology marks the death knell of the folklore secret tunnel, because now they can just, do one of their surveys and find out whether there is a tunnel or not. So yes, that has sort of ruined a bit of the magic. But as I said, if you look at the one on Nottingham, it's very impressive.
Oh, what a pity. Right, we've got another one here. Why do you think we love so much the idea of hidden or forgotten streets and houses? And Diagon Alley is quoted here. Why is it such an exciting idea?
Yes, well, I think the hidden is always intriguing and mystifying, isn't it? I think the idea. I think that's why secret tunnels are so ubiquitous in fiction and in film. Is that you always love the idea that if you look behind a tapestry like the one behind me, you're suddenly going to find a doorway that's going to lead you into a tunnel underground that will bring you out somewhere totally different. So I think it's part of the whole history of stories, really, that the people always like a mystery. They always like the idea that there's some hidden world, or even like a hidden world, another dimension beyond the present. So I think it feeds into all of that. But I do, as I said, I hope the mystery of secret tunnels and these sort of secret folkloric places will survive.
Brilliant. We've got another one from Stuart. He says, Peter Ackroyd, the author, in his book London Under, claims the proposed Bakerloo extension from Elephant to Camberwell, which appears on the 1949 tube maps, were dug, but no track put down. What's your take on that?
Yes. Yeah, I think that is correct. I'm not sure. I mean, again, this is something that I did a long time ago. I think it's definitely in Subterranean City. There was a plan to extend the Bakerloo line from Elephant and Castle, and there have been various other plans put forward, I think, fairly recently as well, to actually make that happen. I mean, this was a long time ago, the original idea of extending it, and I think that some of the tunnels were dug. Yes, yeah. So I'm not sure how far they went, because I can't remember now off the top of my head. but that is definitely something that that was explored, and digging was undertaken. But I can't remember how far the tunnels go. But there have been various plans put forward over the last few years to make that happen again. In reality, the extension of the Bakerloo line from Elephant and Castle. So yeah, he's right in that supposition. Yeah.
Okay, there's got one here from Mike Thompson. He says, there has been talk of building a tunnel under Park Lane to allow pedestrian access to Hyde Park. I was told that the reason it has never gone ahead is that no one knows how many tunnels are under the road. Do you have any views on that?
I think there already are, aren't there? I mean, there are some tunnels under Park Lane, but I've no idea how many others there are. So no, I'm sorry, but I think there are already some. I think there is at least one subway that goes under Park Lane. I haven't been there for a while, but yeah, I don't know about that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Any info re passage between Black Cap and Mother Red Cap pubs in Camden Town? It's good to be like pub questions.
Yeah, I know. No, there are so many. I mean, there are. Every pub seems to have a secret tunnel. I mean, more than a ghost. I know a lot of them make a lot of. They get a lot of interest from people who want to visit the pub because of the ghosts. But I think that there are even more stories of secret tunnels. I think there's probably very few pubs that don't have a so-called secret tunnel. I mean, there are where I live in Hastings, there are quite a few that say they've got secret tunnels, particularly one called the Stag, which is a very old pub in the old town, and that's supposed to have a secret tunnel that goes down to the sea. The Mother Red Cap, and I mean, one of the things that you find is with secret tunnels is if places have similar names, or if they're related in some way by a family that may have owned two properties, things like that, they tend to generate these secret tunnel stories. So maybe the Mother Red Cap and the Black Cap is purely because of the name similar, and so therefore they are linked in some way, and that way becomes a secret tunnel. Oh, one thing I meant to show you, I don't know if you can see this, but this is a version of my secret tunnel book that it's a one-off that I had a paper artist called Linda Toigo have a go at one of these books, and she's made various holes in it like tunnels, and if you look at the side there's a little man sitting in a hole in the book. So I do like that, and I very rarely get a chance to show it because when I'm at talks, you can't see these things up close. So I thought I'd show it.
Just hold it up a little bit more.
Can you see that? Can you see it?
A little bit higher, yeah, that's good.
A bit higher.
Looks beautiful.
Yeah, and then there's the man sitting there. Can you see that?
Yep, can just about see the man.
Okay.
Right, we're coming to the end. Are you okay to take a couple more questions, Anthony, and then we'll wrap it up?
Oh, my pizza's there. Oh, don't worry. Yeah, okay.
We'll make it just one more.
One or two more. Yeah.
So we've got. What a great talk. Thank you. Wondered whether any fiction writers, book, movie, or TV have ever consulted you with your expert knowledge when they were researching for their stories. If so, who and what?
Well, that's a very good question, and I can't think of any who have ever consulted me. So, although I know there's a writer called Mark Samuels who has written a kind of, he specialises in writing weird fiction, and he did write a story that featured me. I think I was under the name Adam Drayton. I think that's what he called me in his short story. I think it was about someone who goes into an abandoned underground station and comes to a sticky end. So I can think of that one, but I mean, there are various artists who've got in touch with me, like Stephen Walter, who does these very, very detailed maps of London. And I know for a fact that he has been influenced by some of the stuff that I've done, one or two of my books, because he came up after one of my talks and told me that. And the artist Karen Russo. There are various people. I think it seems to be more, I don't know why, but it seems to be more influential on artists than on films and literature. But there we are. Yeah, thanks.
Right, well, we have gone over, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up now. But Antony, thank you so much for that talk. That was wonderful. And I'd like to thank our audience as well for coming and for all the great comments we've had in the Q&A. I've read out a few of the questions, but we've actually got almost a little folklore anthology that's coming up in the Q&A now. We've got a little bit of chat going.
Interesting reading, yeah.
Okay, well, that's the end of the evening. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Have a good evening. Antony, enjoy your pizza.
Thank you. Good night.